how many of you have been to the high Arctic? Because we're going to take a trip today. Well, after this morning, you will have all been there. Because that's what I like to use my images for, is to try to, part of my job, I guess, as working with Lindblad and National Geographic has been in the marketing side and the education side, but to try to get you wanting to go to these amazing places, to educate people, and then hopefully people then will care about the far north. So we're going to start out by closing your eyes. And so if you can picture the earth revolving around the sun, if you're looking at me, your eyes aren't closed. Revolving around the sun, and why do the seasons happen? Picture the earth tilted 23.5 degrees away from the sun in our winter. So the North Pole is tilted, right? That's why we have the Arctic Circle, where the light rays hit at a tangential way, and it goes dark in winter in the north. But what happens in summer when the earth comes back around and points towards the sun? The sun never sets. It's the land of the midnight sun. So going up there on an expedition, now you're on a ship, you've flown to some port, and you're going north. And one of the first questions we get, are we going to see the northern lights on this trip? You'd have to come at a different time of year or later in the season. But what's amazing about, and you're going to see a lot of pictures of images of wildlife, especially the ice bear, the king of the north. But the Arctic, it's about ice and it's about light. Because imagine when the sun it's not setting, but it stays low to the horizon early in the spring. And then the problem is, you've had dinner, you're tired from a long day, and then the light starts getting good, about midnight, 1 a.m., passing an iceberg on a calm night. A supermoon up around Ellesmere Island, up in the far north of Arctic Canada. Light, it's just, everything balances when the sun is really, that's why we go out at those magic times. Things balance, the light balances. Images like this aren't fair because a lot of times it's blowing and ripples on the water, but here's kind of the albatross of the far north. It's not an albatross, I just forgot the bird. But it is a tube-nosed bird that glides with us, a fulmar, the northern fulmar. And it glides one way and it goes the other way, and sometimes they dip their wings. So what's amazing is those two images were made on the same night. There's many of my images that come from a handful of nights. I've been going up to the north for almost 30 years, and there are these magic moments that just stay with us. So you've got the ice, you've got glaciers. Up in Svalbard, 60% of the land is under ice. A much higher percentage over in Greenland, although, as you know, that's changing. So life happens in this summer. There's the food web blooms, and the birds come back. The migrating birds come back. So here you have kittiwakes, that when the glaciers calve, upwelling happens, and the kittiwakes go crazy, and they come in and feed on the upwelling plankton and little animals there. The Arctic tern. The Arctic tern is the king. Well, the polar bear is the king. The Arctic tern is the champion of migration. It nests in the north, above the Arctic Circle, but then in winter it flies all the way into Antarctica, many of them. Pole to pole, sees more daylight than any other animal on Earth, except for the naturalists that work with Lindblad Expeditions that do the same thing. Though we get there in a different way. There's one of the holy grail birds for birders. Are there any bird nerds in the audience? There's probably some listening at home. It's fun knowing that this is being simulcast, because I got emails from people in Quebec and Philadelphia that they might be watching this morning. But this is the ivory gull. And the ivory gull, if you see ivory gulls kind of flitting about over the ice somewhere, you can just barely see. Because remember, there's a kind of a misconception that you just go north and then the polar bears come out from behind the ice and you just see them, but you got to look for them. So if there's ivory gulls flitting about on the ice, you look hard because they might be indicating that a bear is there on a kill. The dovekies, probably the most numerous bird up in the Arctic, these little flying footballs, there by the tens of thousands in the cliffs. And normally, and I'm going to give you, this talk is kind of in 3 parts. It's a little bit retrospective because I do get emotional talking about the Arctic. I've been going there a long time. Hopefully it's going to be, give you a sense of the place. But then also there'll be some instructional parts of it in terms of the photography. And normally I avoid the white sky, like the plague up there. If it's just a white blank sky, you know, you work with what's in the foreground and because I do love diffuse light. The worst thing that I want up there is just a perfectly sunny day. It's not bad at night when you get the warm light, but so here are the dovekies just in swarms against the white sky. So I converted it into black and white to make it, no, they're black and white birds against the white sky. No conversion needed. And then, of course, maybe everyone's favorite little clown bird are the puffins. And this is on the island of Grimsey in Iceland. Has anyone been to Iceland? Great destination. And this island sits right on the Arctic Circle in the far north. So it's up there around 66 degrees. And the puffins come there because there's lots of fish off the island. And we go there with the ships. And I'm going to go up there this summer and spend 5 days. They actually have a hostel there now, a guest house where you can stay and photograph the puffins. And then on this day, the wind was blowing so hard, and it was misting and raining. You couldn't turn your camera towards the wind because it would just soak your lens, so you worked pointing downwind. But what were the puffins trying to do when they land? They're flying upwind, and they're almost hovering. They weren't even moving. So it's pretty cool to photograph them, where they're just kind of hovering as they come in for landings with their little sandlands fish to feed their young. And then on good days, they're just down on the water. There's no wind, you know, so it's kind of time to relax. Another part of Iceland, but they're just such beautiful birds. A little reflection. So this is in a zodiac, so it's times when we get out on the water. So when you go there in summer, there's all this life. A razorbill, the champion of fish in the beak. It's got a longer bill than the puffin. I just wonder how many can a razorbill do? But it's not all about, you know, just photographing the wildlife, because underneath your feet and fertilized by the birds. I mean, if you're cruising along and you see this big green cliff and it looks like, you know, the 9th hole in a golf course, it's usually, there's a reason there's a bird cliff there. And then you have the tundra. And of course there's the joke, you know, if you get lost in the tundra, just stand up, because everything's small. You've got to get down. That's why you wear rain pants even on good days just to lay down. And so on a really rainy day, you can concentrate on your macro and protect your gear. And so there are just carpets of wildflowers up there when the snow leaves and the ice is just out on the ocean. And some of these flowers only bloom for a week, and then the next weather comes in. So they've got to do their business pretty quickly up there. The Svalbard, or the Arctic poppy. So you get these little cup poppies up there that are beautiful. And you do need a day without wind to photograph these. So they vibrate like crazy, like a little piezoelectric dust removal system that you have in your cameras when the wind's blowing. And then there are Arctic fox. And this was shot in Iceland in a preserve in the northwest part of Iceland, and it's the only area, there's one area in Iceland where the fox aren't hunted, and it's up there in the northwest, in the West Fjords. And there's caribou. This is in Svalbard, and I'll show you a map here in a little bit. But it's just so rich, because if you haven't been there and you think of the Arctic, you think, well, it's just ice and there's no trees, you're above tree line. Of course, if you heard Eric Goose talk yesterday, you heard about the 4 million people that live above the Arctic Circle. If you listen to Paul North from Meet the Ocean, well, Eric was Meet the North, Paul's Meet the Ocean, but his name is Paul North. I'm confused. But if you listen to his talk, the oceans are so rich there with the pumping of the nutrients. Do you have to show the whole animal to know what you're looking at? The walrus. This is when you want to back your zodiac up. And it's the last thing a clam sees, because walrus go down and feed on shells, clams. And they can apparently suck the meat right out of a clam. I don't know what PSI that takes, but we're going to back up from that boat. And then, what would you call this seal if you saw this seal the first time? Probably a mustache seal, but it's a bearded seal. And it's one of the favorite foods of the king of the Arctic, the polar bear. You also want to back up if you see this. Now, we do most of our photography up there from the ship or Zodiacs. And I don't know why. I mean, people that go to Africa, they always want to get the kills. And the chase is good and then get the kill. But I've never gone into someone's home where their kill is hanging on their wall and where they look at it every day. But it is something that raises the stakes when there's something out there that sees you on land that will try to eat you. So you stay with the gun on shore. We do carry protection, and we've never had any incidents because if we see a polar bear, we move on. We go back to the ship. So there were a lot of close-ups there. The images that I love to make in any environment are the ones that show what lives there, and it shows the landscape. You know, whether it might be a tropical rainforest or, in this case, up in the far north. So showing the ice. And when I first went up there, almost 30 years ago, we were shooting film. I was even shooting medium format. So when I started thinking about some of the things I wanted to talk to you about in this talk, I went back into the archives and pulled out some shots that were, this is a scan of course, we were using state-of-the-art. At that time, it was Fujichrome film, Velvia or Provia. Sometimes we'd push it to 200 ISO so we could get the shot. This is back to digital, though. So the light and working with the light. And we'll talk more about light, but you know, you think about light, you've got some diffuse light like we had last night at sunset. You've got side light, and then working with backlight. So getting the rim light on animals. And the beautiful thing about the ice is there's usually enough reflected light coming in that lights in this case, the polar bear's face. And you can lighten things a little bit in your processing in Photoshop as well. But I love being out there in the magic light. So this is probably a polar bear at 1, 2 in the morning in the far north. And then some just do lend themselves to black and white. So it is fun to play with your sliders. And you've probably all done that. You're in your second, third glass of wine, and it's looking real good. And then you wake up in the morning and you go, what did I do? So you got to be careful. Have you ever seen a fog bow? So fog bows are really cool. And you do need, this was with a fisheye lens to get both ends, but that's a cool optical phenomena up there. Hard to find bears in the Arctic in the fog, and it's hard to navigate. So fog is kind of, clearing fog's okay, and we've had some magical experiences going into fjords with clearing fog, but foggy days are tough. We give a lot of talks. Now, there's this thing called the green flash. Have you heard of the green flash? When the Roy G. Biv and how the atmosphere diffracts the light, or is it refract? We have physicists in the audience? Good. But when you think about the colors of the rainbow and you're getting these higher energy wavelengths that are still making it through the atmosphere, you can get a violet. So there's the green flash, and then it goes violet. So this is through a cloud in the far north, and this optical phenomena, this spreading of the wavelengths as it's going through the atmosphere, kind of like a prism. This must have lasted 15 minutes because the sun is just lingering there on the, and I guess pilots flying towards green flashes, they last a long time too if you can keep it right at the sun. It's really the green speck. But there are northern lights up there. Now, they can be happening when it's bright and you don't see them. But if you linger and come through the Arctic in September, you get this light show, which is, it's like magic. I was too young in the 60s, but I heard that people saw a lot of these in the 60s. And to talk about passion, I mean, one of the things that we can't really teach is passion. You've got to grab that in yourself, and you know that in the type of photography you do. And it starts with passion, and I love many of Steve Jobs' quotes. But when you discover your true passion in photography, that's when you're really willing to work on things. You know, if you're into macro, you're willing to edit down to your favorite images and work on those and make prints or put them in your book or whatever your project might be. So if you can get, pun intended, a focus in your own work, you're going to be much more effective with your images, and you'll make better images because of that. So some of the retrospective here, so a lot of my work has been photographing, and all our photographers and guests that go up to explorers that are on these ships, I mean, we're all on assignment to bring back images, to educate people, and to make, well, why do I photograph? Because it's my job. Wasn't it Shackleton who said, someone asked him, Shackleton, remember the boat that got crushed in the ice down the Antarctic? And they asked him, why do you explore? And he said, because it's my job. But I didn't set out to be a photographer. I was a geologist to begin with, and I'm still a geologist, but photography has been my ticket around the world. So this goes back to 1994. And I show this image because it's probably the first polar bear I ever saw. And I was lugging around my Pentax 645 medium format camera. I guess that was a 300 millimeter lens, but since it's so big, I don't know what even the equivalent was. And it was like 2 a.m, and this curious bear came over. Now, when you click a medium format camera, you know you make a picture, right? Chung, chung. And it was all manual. And so, do you remember having the spot meter? You'd have to look. Luckily, we painted the deck of our ship medium gray. So you'd meter on the ship, set your camera up, and then photograph the bear. So I went back to my archives. Does anyone still have slides in slide drawers? And it was kind of an interesting time because a couple of these drawers, I mean, I did move them from Santa Fe to Charlotte, North Carolina about 3 years ago. So maybe some of those drawers, but I bet a couple of those drawers hadn't been opened in 10 years. So it's kind of nostalgia, so I pulled a few things out to show there's still things in there. The other thing you can see across the top is my museum of my technology through the years. You can see a Linhof 4x5. That's how I trained myself in photography, was as a landscape photographer in the Southwest. I never did have a Brownie camera because I wasn't into photography as a kid, so I had to get one of those. So that's kind of inserted. There's my Mac Plus computer, bought in 1986, state of the art at the time. And there's a Pentax 645 there, and a Canon film camera, and the original iPhone on the right. That's going to be worth big bucks one of these days. So I pulled out some of my chromes, and I had to dig out my light table and set it up, and because I wanted to show you that bear was farther away at one point, walking up the ice edge. So imagine that. You've never seen a polar bear before, and here's the bear walking up the ice edge. And many of you have traveled with us. Stefan Lundgren, he was a long-time naturalist with us, and he was very helpful to me on my first trip. He goes, "You have to wait." He's Swedish. He goes, "You have to wait. There will be one moment, and then you will make the picture." Which was very wise, and it's still wise to this day, but I kept shooting. But back then, you'd shoot a whole roll on one bear. You might take 30 pictures of that bear. Now we have people filling cards, 3,000 pictures in the span of an hour. So Fujichrome Velvia. And then there were other bears. And there were bearded seals. This, again, going back to shooting film, bears with cubs. And it's interesting, when you look at it, we're so critical of our images these days because we can look at things one-to-one on our computer. And then you read the blogs and like, oh, this lens is vignettes in the corners and So we're not going to buy that lens. And then you look at your pictures, oh, it's a little soft at 1:1. Well, we used to look at our pictures with an 8x, maybe a 4x loop. Say, oh yeah, that's sharp. It wasn't 1:1. Bear peeking over. And one of our creative editors is in the room here, and they still go back and pull some of these scans. They crop up in brochures still. I'm not going to take you through all the different equipment I've ever used, but it sure is liberating now to have 100 to 400 zooms, high-resolution cameras. Cropping is not illegal. So people are always asking, what do I need to photograph polar bears? Do I need the real, 600, 800 millimeters, and do I need to stand there? And really the answer is no with these high-resolution cameras, be it Canon, Sony, Olympus, what's the other one? Nikon. Some people have Pentax. And it's really amazing. If you shoot a sharp, well-exposed image, and you use Lightroom in a good way, and you don't cheat the digital police, then cropping is legal. So I'm going to show you some examples of how Karen has used some of these images in the brochures. So here's a bear with its beautiful reflection, and we love reflections. And then you can crop it, and then you can destroy it with that yellow rectangle was not there when I made the picture. So photographers and type, but it is covering the blood I covered the blood by cropping, I guess. So now imagine you're standing on the ship at a very safe distance looking down at the bear. And is that bear disturbed? I mean, this bear kept falling back asleep and then looking up at us. And it's usually the young ones that are curious. Older bears have been educated because they've seen ships and they realize that they're not going to get food and the people aren't going to come off and they can't jump on them. So this one kept looking at us. That was probably the first shot before it walked up a little further. But you can crop that as well. Nice placement of the logo. But for me, it's seeing the bear out on the ice. And I do wish I had a video of them walking. I've got to do a video of some walrus swimming, but my next talk I'll have some video of the way they walk on the ice and jump between ice flows. Wait, this one's backwards. See what they do? At least they didn't add a ship in the distance. That happens sometimes. And then the light. Remember, it is about the light. So when that magic light's happening, and we have a saying on board the ship, we used to call it, well, we have a photographic emergency. Everyone come out on deck. And then 3 people showed up in the lounge one time in their life jackets. So we changed it to photographic alert so that you'll come out and then make that picture. Now, this was an interesting situation because and you're always trying to do something different. So, we've seen a lot of polar bears during the trip at this point. And so I was going to try on a monopod, and many of us have done this, where you put it on a monopod and you put the timer on, you go beep, 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 click. And so I thought, yeah, I could get this shot with people looking down on the bear. And then someone says, oh, the bear's standing up. And I'm like, oh, geez, perfect time to be doing this with a wide angle and the bear stands up. So there I am. I don't know if that was Bob's shot or who gave me that. Could be Bob Schaefer's shot from Philadelphia. But the bear did stand up, and luckily, my little click, click, click went. I did get a shot of it standing up, so that one has been used. So does that make you want to be there? If you come, wear red or blue. Looks good on the bow. So shots like this, looking down, I mean, if you've seen shots from Churchill, a lot of them, you're in tundra buggies and you're looking down. And it's great to be close to bears, and they're curious, and they're waiting. If you haven't been to Churchill, it's a cool spot, because I used to think the bears came to Churchill because they were attracted by the town, but when you go there, you learn that the Churchill River is putting fresh water into Hudson's Bay, and that's where the ice freezes first in the fall. So the bears know this, so for thousands of years, they've been coming to that area. But this looking down on the bear isn't always the best angle. I'd prefer to take them when they're further away for a number of reasons. But it does make a compelling cover, a compelling image that makes you want to go meet that bear. using foreground, telling the story about how close you are getting. And then this is one from last summer. And so you don't need to see a lot of polar bears. I know I've had guests come up to me just yesterday saying, on the trip that we took up there, we saw 38 bears. And numbers are great, but it's the quality bear that you want, the curious one that gives you all the poses. And this one came up and pretty much did it all out on the ice. So again, I'm not here, I'm not looking down, I'm shooting when it's farther away with a longer lens. Now we've got to shoot down because it got curious. And there is a picture, you see that of a bear looking in a porthole because they're curious. And then this one, we've had this happen maybe twice maybe 2-3 times in the last 30 years where they come up and they actually lean against the ship, but what a beautiful bear. It was like, you could tell it was a rainy day or it had been swimming. Yeah. So this is the part of the world we're talking about, and this is the part of the world that our ships go to, and we've got, in 2 weeks I'll be meeting the Orion in Seward, Alaska, and we're going to go out the Aleutian chain to Kamchatka, so that's a new part of the world. But we're talking about Iceland and Greenland. I've showed you pictures from Svalbard, and then that Northwest Passage area, Baffin Island. Eric showed some pictures from Pond Inlet on Baffin Island, and then there's some of our trips we try to get as far north as we can up around Ellesmere Island, just off to the west of Greenland. So in the land of the ice bears, the beautiful thing about this is you can fly to Oslo, get on a plane, and fly to 76 degrees north. So we're talking about much farther north. You start looking at the north of Norway and Svalbard, you're way above Alaska. And this, of course, has been the marquee image here, the iconic image that we've been using on the marketing. But to get that interaction, that eye-to-eye interaction, it kind of gives me chills, that look. It's like, who are you and can I eat you? And if you weren't to the introduction yesterday, I'm just going to go through briefly, 9/10 ice. This is pack ice. This is frozen seawater. 2 types of ice. There's the ice that comes from the land, the glacial ice, and then this pack ice, the frozen seawater. And it's the multi-year ice that we're losing, the real hummocky, hard ice, the polar bear footprints. So there's bears out there. You've got to search for them. And then this was that day, and I just want to show you this day again if you hadn't been there. The guy watching, and there's 2 people in Philadelphia that were there. And it's always fun when someone shows you a picture, and then I can say, I was standing right next to you when you made that picture. But it was this day, this perfect day with no wind and reflections, when we have this young bear that came over toward the ship. And so you're trying to get those moments. You're trying to pick those moments. And again, imagine this with film. You don't want to run out of film. Many of our best pictures in the film days were shot 34, 35, 36, because you're waiting for that moment. And now here we're just blazing away with digital images, which makes editing kind of fun. And coming up to where you get the reflection. And then that pause I like this image, I guess, better. The jump is kind of iconic, but this, what is this bear thinking about? Where is this bear today? That's what I was thinking about with that one in the film shot that I showed you from early on. A bear from 25 years ago, is that bear still alive? What's going on? And then the sequence. So numbers, just fast enough to freeze it, usually over 1,000th of a second for most wildlife. Show the ice, show the situation. Bears are patient for no end to wait at that seal hole for a seal to pop up. And then how you frame this, and I was going to show you a whole sequence of frames because there is ice in front of the ship here. But how you frame an image really can set the feeling tone of it. Because here it looks like the mother and the cub, they're on the last little piece of ice and they're looking out there, how they're going to find their, and we see that now the way images are used, and climate change and the change that's happening. And I'm a geologist, I believe in climate change because the Earth is over 4 billion years old. The climate's changed a lot during that time. There's been ice ages that have come, there's been ice ages that have gone, but it's the rate of change that's so alarming now. So where is that ice? Where is that seal? Where are they going to get their next meal? And this is what we're facing in the north. Think of going to the Arctic Ocean and then there's no ice. Now, 30 years ago, when we'd go to Svalbard, we had to go in late July. Yeah, it was mid to late July before we could actually navigate around some of the islands and circumnavigate. Now we've got to be there in May to find the same amount of ice. So it's almost a 2-month difference. And there's local perturbations, of course. I mean, some years have heavier ice years just depending on storms and wind. But it's the multi-year ice. And so if you were to go back in time to the 80s, so this is before my time in the Arctic. I didn't get up here, I think, till 91, 92. The real bright white ice depicted in this is the multi-year ice. And I point with the red arrow to that percentage, and the percentage of multi-year ice is going down. So this is the ice that makes it through the summer and that gets refrozen back in the pack ice, and that is what's disappearing at an alarming rate. And once that's gone, then you can have an ice-free Arctic summer up there in the north. Now, everyone's heard of Shackleton, right? And the demise of the Endurance. And our new ship's going to be called the Endurance. But it was a great ship. I mean, it's got a good story. You wouldn't call a ship the Titanic, but the Endurance is, that says adventure. But there is this man, Fridtjof Nansen. Whoever heard of the Fram? Yay, thank you. Fridtjof Nansen was an amazing man, a Norwegian man who built a ship to purposely get stuck in the ice. Back, 2 decades before Shackleton's trip down south. And he wrote this book about his adventures up there. And so he was doing it for science. He had heard that from the wreck of a U.S. expedition in the late 1800s, the Jeannette, they found it was wrecked in a different part of the Arctic, and they found the wreckage of the Jeannette in western Greenland. And so Nansen said, there's a circumpolar drift, and if I just lock my ship in the right spot, I can just drift past the pole. So they got on the Fram, and they were so comfortable. They had wind generators for lights, they had electric lights, they had music, and they purposely went and got frozen up in the ice, and they wanted to go from the New Siberian Islands. And next year, we're going to be doing a Northeast Passage trip on the Endurance, trying not to get stuck in the ice. And we're going to go past some of these islands, which will be exciting. But that was the plan. Well, what happened was they did get stuck in the ice, but then he realized, and everything was working. The ship was riding beautifully. They were comfortable. But he got impatient, and so he decided, okay, I'm going to ski to the pole. And it turned out that he was kind of on a treadmill, and even though they were skiing out there, he and his mate Johansen, they weren't going to make it, so they had to abandon. And that's when their adventure started, because they got back to Franz Josef Land here, and they had to overwinter, and they're hunting. And a couple of years ago, we went to Franz Josef Land with the Explorer, and we're at this site where they overwintered up there in the late 1800s. And we could still see some of the stones that were moved for their shelter. And look at the tundra there, this beautiful red reindeer moss and moss that when you don't have reindeer up there, it just grows thick. And so here are these guys, so Nansen and Johansen, and it's one of these heroes. You hear this all the time, these Arctic heroes that are on their path. This is what they were meant to do, and then somehow they get rescued. Of course, we never hear the story about the guys that perished because they didn't write their books. So it could be biased. But he ran into an expedition. So there's the Fram, purposely locked in the ice. And they did get to 86 degrees north in the May of 1896. But then he runs into this guy, Jackson, who he had not led on the expedition. He had applied to be on it, and he was shunned from it. So the guy mounted his own expedition and ended up rescuing Nansen. How's that for... So don't burn bridges in your deals. And so they got back and they got reunited. And that's the story of the Fram up in the north. So there was a time when all that ice up there was a lot more than today. And If you do read about Fridtjof Nansen, there was something called the Nansen Passport in World War I. He did some great things. He got a Nobel Peace Prize, and he was also the first man to ski across Greenland. Talk about an overachiever. Great man. So a little bit of teaching then. A few teaching tips. And I do this a lot, so I distill it down, and some of this is review, which is fine, but I've been photographing for a long time, and I'm still reminding myself of things. And the first would be the mantra, light, composition, moment. You're going to look for the light, you're going to make a beautiful composition, you're going to wait for some kind of moment. But when people ask, when you come up to an environment that's foreign to you, you're overwhelmed. But it still comes back to, try to get clean backgrounds. Try to minimize if it's a bright blank sky. Foreground, giving depth, framing your image, find frames. Details, shoot those close-ups. And I'll give you some examples. Most people will want to avoid putting people or boats in their photos. That's typically what we all do. But if you do that, you tell a much better story about your expedition. You give scale. And it makes your friends and family want to be there. So simple backgrounds, that's easy to visualize. Not putting the head against all the ice, getting down low and here's a Arctic turn coming in. This is in Iceland. And you can position yourself. You can position yourself so that little chick is against a rocky shore. And a lot of the wildlife photos, if you photograph the wildlife, that when you really have a chance to nail it is when it's happening repeatedly, right? So the birds are going out getting fish and they're coming back to feed their young. So it's not like, oh, there it is, click, got it, back to the cafe. You got to hang there and keep shooting. So stopping it with 2,000th of a second. Minimizing bright sky, and I've seen this only once where there's the polar bear walking across the ice shelf up in, well, it's not really an ice shelf, but the ice cap in northeast land of Svalbard, and could have shot, and I did shoot it a number of ways. So it's not like I say this is the shot. You start out with what we call the safety shot. You're approaching something, and before the light changes, you just start shooting, knowing it may not be the moment, hoping that you're going to get a better moment. But in this case, I'm minimizing sky, emphasizing the cliff and the bear. This was just last summer where we were in the fog. And instead of going towards the glacier, we went out towards the ice because we did see coming into our anchorage footprints on the ice. And so we said, well, let's go the other way and see if there's a polar bear out here, when this bear just walked out of the fog down to the cliff. And so there's a very tall cliff there, and I could have had the bear, and I did shoot it this way, but I could be showing you a shot, but there's a very tiny bear in this tall cliff. We're emphasizing the bear looking down on its environment, saying, should I go swimming or not? And it did. It went swimming. So this bear had been coming to the shore. It did look at us, didn't pay any attention to us, and then start swimming away. And you don't chase a swimming bear, but it does know you're there. And so we were a respectful distance. And then how do you show a bear swimming through the ice? Use the ice as foreground. And this is where you got to use a single focus point, because if you have a pattern focus point, it's probably going to grab the ice in the foreground. And you'll wonder why my bear is blurry. So taking a single focus point, putting on the bear, holding your finger, however you do it. I'm a back button focuser. So I can, and I'm always ready. I'm always ready for action. So I'm always in burst mode, servo focus, but I do it back button so I've disengaged my focus from the shutter button, because I don't want the shutter clicking the picture and doing exposure and focusing. I let it do exposure and click the shutter so I can nail it. You can hand hold at a 15th or an 1/8 of a second if you take a lot of shots and do a really wide angle in a boat, or you can get out in polar bear country and set up your tripod. But in this case, we were just shooting it from. So getting motion, adding that motion also can be fun. You saw this one before as far as putting things in that blank sky. And black and white, I love. Eric and I, when we're on the ship together and we take a picture, I have to go to him. I call the black and white. No, he can do it. We go back and forth. Sometimes we say, you take the horizontal, I'll take the vertical. It's fun to be out there. But black and white can really set some of those moody days apart in your images. But it's the bear's out on the ice. Now here's where you can, now back in the day, I would use a neutral density filter, and I still will use actual filters that over the camera. So split field neutral density we use a lot. I use a lot, especially in the Grand Canyon where there's a lot of shadows and things. But up in the Arctic, you can use that also to knock down the sky. But in this case, you can use Lightroom. I mean, it's artistic license, but you're darkening the sky, dropping in a filter to darken your sky. And then just avoiding the sky. When it's blank white or blank blue, again, I probably showed the ice going off into the distance, but I came in here purposely because also there's reflections. So in this case, I'm not working with that sky. There's a lot of polar challenges up there, apart from weather and wearing good gloves and proper color, blue or red jackets. White balance. Do you remember back in the film days, you'd have all these prints and you send them in, and then it's like they chose the color balance based on something, and they took all the blue out of your icebergs. And we talk about a lot shooting in cloudy white balance, and most of us, or a lot of us, will shoot raw so that we can adjust the white balance later. But if you're a JPEG shooter, which is fine, because you don't have to process your images far, your camera's doing the processing, you probably want to be in daylight or at least sunny white balance and not in auto so that it's not correcting for the blue. And you don't want your icebergs to start looking kind of muddy and not blue. And you're going to be fooling your camera in exposure all the time because you've got all that white out there, and your camera tries to make what's white gray. And then polarizer, it's not so much for making the sky bluer, because it's pretty blue up there, but for cutting reflections. It can actually cut reflections on the blue icebergs and make them look bluer. So if this was your first shot of a polar bear, it might look like this instead of like this, because your camera's going to darken down because it's trying to make things medium gray, and I probably exaggerated it here. So does it look dark? Yeah, kind of looks like a gloomy day. Well, this probably goes too far on some of the screens, but the ice is pretty bright, even on a cloudy day. So you're going to be purposely overexposing. I call it add light. Well, no, this was Stefan Lundgren, who said add light to light. Keep your histogram. No, this is before digital. Add light to light means it's counterintuitive. You're overexposing what's already bright to keep the ice white. So on cloudy days, sometimes it's almost 2 stops. And if you go +1 now, you can adjust. I mean, with the latitude of these amazing sensors that we have, the technology is just amazing. But you've got to think about it when you're up there. And this is the #1 question I get. I'm going to the Arctic. How do you photograph a polar bear on the ice? And it still comes back to the basics, right? So that triangle. And how many of you now are shooting in manual and letting your ISO fluctuate? Yeah, with these high-resolution cameras, ISO, it almost doesn't matter, especially in a white environment where you're going to be pretty fast shutter speeds anyway. So the camera is really looking out there in terms of black and white, trying to make what's white medium gray. And you want to avoid that, okay, by fooling it. So this is technical. It's a histogram. And the beautiful thing now with the mirrorless cameras and electronic viewfinders is that you can have a live histogram. So that right-hand peak, the highlights, you want that. There's a misconception that you want that in the middle and it should be a bell curve, and I think we're far beyond that. 10 years ago, we'd be all like, oh my God, histogram, this is great. I'm learning how to read my... Now, I mean, you guys are all experts, I think, on exposure, but keep those highlights way to the right. And you do that with exposure compensation, of course, with your little plus-minus dial button or however you get there. So this would be on a Canon camera. And I like it to where plus is to the right and underexposed is to the left. That's the way I think about things. My camera, because you can set your dials. So your goal is to go from the gray bear on the gray ice to the white polar bear on the white ice. When you've got an Arctic tern coming down at your head because you're near its, you don't want to underexpose it and insult it. You want to purposely overexpose it so that you get a good exposure. And you're out there in the bright light, and that's another struggle with some of the electronic viewfinders is it's really bright and it's hard to read things. And so we're all sitting there looking through our viewfinder and trying. So if you're just looking at your screen, you take a picture and review it on your screen, it's really hard to tell what the exposure was because it's hard to see and it fools us. The proper exposure tends to look underexposed. It tends, no, it tends to look overexposed. So if you're just looking at your screen, you're going to keep underexposing to make it look good, and then have you ever had that? Maybe I only have the trouble. You get back to your computer, and you have to brighten your images up there. Finding foreground. Whenever when we're out cruising for composition, we're looking for foreground ways of framing things. This is one of the most beautiful fjords. Remember, I'm a geologist. Has anyone been to Sedona? The Red Rocks of Sedona, or anyone out in the southwest? Red rocks on Greenland with blue icebergs. I don't think there's any place else in the world where we get that combination. I want to get back there. Now, when there is a perfect day with a disgustingly blue sky, as I call it, use reflections. That's a good time for reflections. And you can break the rule of thirds, too. You can put the reflection right in the middle. You're the artist. You can do whatever you want. But reflections up there. When the wind's not blowing and you've got clouds and ice and mountains. And this is why Svalbard's so amazing, because the jagged peaks. Svalbard and Greenland were together once, so the eastern part of Greenland is very mountainous as well and has spectacular mountains like this carved by the ice over the years. Using, in this case, the ice cap as foreground, and then we wait for that moment, so there's a fulmar flying over. Be good to have a polar bear up there looking down. Kayak going off the waterfall. So my rule of thumb is that if you have an interesting foreground, use the foreground, forget about the sky. But if you have an interesting sky, you might go the other way and just show the same ice cap. So different situations, but beautiful ripples in the sky with those waterfalls. And then patterns. That's another way to separate your images, is to find patterns. So what's that polar bear going for? There's the seal up there. And this is one where it did look better in black and white. It was a kind of a gray day, and that seal just pops out there. So again, foreground. So again, I was thinking about the ice here with that bear. This is obvious, right? You got an arch, you're going to shoot it every which way. Getting down on the tundra, sometimes you have to make your own foreground. There aren't tall trees up there, and so here's reindeer antlers and part of a skull. So get down and shoot through it. Walrus tusks, a walrus skull. Getting shooting, showing some of the landscape. And this is where your eye, I mean, look how your eye goes. The mountains to the right, in that upper right-hand corner, when you're making this picture, aren't going to be really obvious to you. So the more you work with your images, you're going to see that matters, going from the tusks and looking off into the distance. Even though it's tiny in the frame, when you start really studying your images, it becomes important. So that's why composition, watching your corners, watching your edges, what you include is as important as what you don't include. A little frame through a whalebone, a tufted saxifrage. And then, if you're dealing with inclement weather, then start using the drops and get in there and diffuse light. There's Kim Hecox pointing out some moss campion. So this purple saxifrage is the northernmost flowering plant on the planet. It gets farther north towards the pole. Not this individual one, but you would find those up there. And this is reindeer fur. So there's reindeer fur on the tundra, and using that to make it a different type of an image. Or the kittiwake feather, and they're all over the place, and they're stuck in, especially below the cliffs, and they get stuck in the flowers. So it becomes a treasure hunt. There's a masterpiece out there somewhere. You just have to find it. And I love finding the old whale bones. Many of these are from the whaling days. Others are just from times when the whales washed up, died along the shore, and then you get isostatic rebound. When the ice leaves the landscape slowly comes up, and that's what's happening in many of our northern areas. And so the land's getting higher, and so you find whale bones, 100 meters from the shoreline, covered with flowers. The spider plant. So once you start going macro in the tundra, there's no going back. You're down there. More saxifrage in the rocks. And water droplets in self-portrait. But what's out there? It raises the stakes to be laying on your belly in the tundra when there can be bears out there. So that's why we have guides out there watching. So when we have a little cluster of macro photographers, we're very safe. But stay with the gun. Now, there are those bright sunny days. So does everyone have a portable cloud? So we have these little diffusion discs. So we'll make our own cloudy days at times. So that's when you know you have a good trip, when sometimes you have to make clouds and not fog. So the difference between shooting in that and then having where the colors become more saturated. So then including people in boats. Of course, we do this because we want you to think, I want to be in that boat. And I want to take that boat through that cave in that iceberg. No, you don't want to go through the cave in the iceberg. That could spell disaster. But, there are big icebergs out there, and there's ways, that boat's far beyond, the other side of the iceberg. They're not really under that cliff of ice. It just looks that way. Is that Eric driving? No, I don't think that's Eric there. But these are the type of shots when on your trips, on your own adventures, you need. You need shots where you're doing something and where you're at the waterfall in eastern Greenland. Or you're in the kayak. So can you kayak faster than a swimming polar bear? We still haven't tested that, I don't think, up there yet. Or laying down in the tundra again. So when people ask about equipment, having knee pads where you can kneel, getting down's easy. It's getting up that's harder. Or just laying in the tundra in a safe situation and making the flowers look tall. And then if it is a clear sky, you can do the old starburst routine. With a wide-angle lens, take your polarizer and other filters off so you don't get a lot of internal lens flare, and then play with the sun in a way to give that starburst look. And the way to do that is to remove all your filters. F-22 said that little aperture will help diffract the light rays. And I tend to underexpose it when I'm going for that situation to accentuate it. And then you can get starburst reflecting off the water. Wonder how that would look in black and white. So that's kind of a fun one there. But all these things are great, but it's really what sets it apart is that moment, getting that moment in your picture. And sometimes it never happens. You're waiting, you're being patient. They said I should be patient. Are we being patient or are we wasting our time? Sometimes you have to ask yourself that question. So being in the right place at the right time, there's no substitute for that. But knowing what you're photographing, especially in wildlife photography, and that's why it's great going on trips where you have naturalists. When a polar bear comes up to the edge of the ice and starts doing this, what's it going to do? It's going to jump. And so it's kind of hinting you off. If a bird defecates, what's it going to do? It might fly. So this bear came up to the edge, tested it, and so we were all ready. Is that out of sequence? No. They are the kings. This bear has not a worry in the world. And then, I don't want to look at you guys anymore. I'm just going to sleep here. And rarely do we see swimming bears that get curious, because swimming bears usually are going from A to B, and they want to conserve their energy. In this situation, we saw this bear, and we said, well, we're just going to sit here. It was on the ship, and that bear swam right past the bow and looked each one of us in the eye, and then went and crawled out in the ice and went to sleep. So that was a cool moment. So I hope you'll want to come to the north, but I'm not going to talk you out of it. But I want to show you this one little video before we do it, before we end here. And that is the Arctic terns get curious and wonder who's there, and you're going to go after their nest, and they'll come after you. And there's this one island we go to that we take a walk through the area, and they're the Arctic terns, and you carry the sticks. They go for the highest point. But here's a little video of I said, don't show the stick, and try not to look like you're freaked out. But if you do it in slow motion with your iPhone, it's really scary. So you want to respect them. You want to keep a respectful distance from all these birds. and enjoy the wildlife out there. And we take you there in a safe way. You want to be prepared. I mean, compare the times of taking a sailing ship to the far north or being a hunter in those days. I mean, if you were an indigenous person, would you rather be collecting coconuts and eating fish in the South Pacific or hunting walrus in the far north? But we sometimes go out in Zodiacs, and this has happened just a couple of times where they get curious about the boats. And keep in mind, we're in an inflatable boat. And then this guy comes and takes a look at you. So here's just a little video to end from last season.
This is the ice, right?
Oh, so we just had one of the best walrus experiences we've ever had up here in the Arctic of Svalbard. We couldn't get ashore, so we took the Zodiacs around the point.
Look how fast the ice is moving.
Groups
There's
of
this
walruses
current going by this point.
in the ice, and they were curious. It was amazing because they kept coming up and around the boats, which can be a little unnerving when you're in an inflatable boat with those big tusks, but they stayed a respectful distance.
How fast that ice is moving.
Everyone got good photos, and it was really exciting. What a afternoon we had in the Arctic.
So I think I'll end there. I'll be happy to entertain any questions, and thanks for coming to Optic. I hope you have a good time.
Hi, just curious about camera freezing and winterizing.
Yeah, well, luckily we go to these places in the summer, so it's not that cold. I mean, it's much warmer than Minnesota in your winter. I don't know where you're from, but extra batteries, and you do protect your gear. One of the problems though is condensation. So if you take it from a warm cabin and just bring it right out on deck, especially if you took a shower in the morning, you can get condensation as it cools down. But typically you have one battery in your camera, one in your pocket, but the batteries now, it would have been a different answer if it was 8-10 years ago with the early batteries and technology. But if you have electronic viewfinders, they do go much faster because that screen is humming all the time. Yep. Not that big a deal, but have a good camera bag.
When shooting the Northern Lights, how did you deal with vibrations of the boat using a tripod?
Luckily, it was really calm, and we were moving really slowly. And I did use a tripod. And typically on land shooting the Northern Lights, you don't want to go too long because they get smeared, so you're still only dealing with 4 to 8 seconds somewhere in there, depending on how fast they're moving. So in this case, it was like 2 or 3 seconds. That one little area in that shot was really bright. And so about 3 seconds, the ship wasn't moving. And then you had to take a lot of shots. But the ship was pretty stable in that situation. Usually we don't take people to the north to shoot the Northern Lights from the ship, but it just happened to happen. But there are great trips like Natural Habitats up to Churchill in December, January. They go for the Northern Lights 4-day trips out of Winnipeg, and they've got it set up for you so that you're on land, and there's warmth somewhere to retreat to when it's minus 30. Yeah, so if you have a tripod, or you can even bounce it on the rail, I mean, if you can get 2 to 3 seconds exposure at a high ISO, you're probably going to be up around 3200, somewhere in there, or maybe even 64, with a wide open aperture. So go wide angle, 2.8. Fisheye is great for getting the sky as well. When I do Northern Lights photography, I'm using a fisheye typically, and then play with the exposure. And you got to shoot a lot of frames if you're on a moving boat in that situation.
I'm amazed at the speed of your ISO.
Sometimes it's really high, you mean?
Yeah,
full frame
Coming
sensors.
from film and
I
wanting
know,
it to be
coming from-
160, I'm blown away by the high ISO.
I know.
Tell me about that.
Well, there's this new thing called digital.
Yeah.
And these big sensors, seriously, that's why the difference in price of cameras usually has to do with the size of the sensor, and so full frame sensors, which means it's as large as 35 millimeter piece of film back in the day, 3x2. It's amazing, the technology. You can shoot, I mean, we've had published images in the catalogs probably with 6400 at least. The smaller the sensor, then the more grain, because there's the photoreceptor sites on the sensor aren't as large. Also, though, the real trick is Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. There is noise reduction in there. It used to be it was Noise Ninja, and you turned it on and it cranked all night, 10 years ago to take the noise out. Now there's these sliders. I mean, you can also ruin your image by smoothing it too much, but all digital images, especially when you're pushing the edges like that, they need to be processed, and they need to be processed in a good way. So we shoot raw, right? But yeah, ISO, that whole thing of, you can shoot high ISO in certain situations, because what would you rather have? A blurry shot where you didn't push it because you worry about noise? Because a blurry shot, you're going to delete it. If you've got a noisy shot, but you nailed it, and then you can convert it black and white, and then it's art if you have noise in there, right? Right, David? Noise and black and white. I mean, you might even add grain.
Great the size of golf balls.
Great question. Yes, one last question.
Okay, when you were shooting from the ship with a long lens, you were just doing that handheld?
The question is, yeah, with a lot of times I'd use the monopod. Yeah, because even with the newer cameras, so short, shorter zooms, some of the 100 to 400 zooms now, depending what you have, are only this big. Now go out there and look at the Sigma 150 to 600, which you should get because you really want a big lens to be professional. But how long can you do this, even with a smaller camera? Years ago, I could do it a lot longer. But when you get to be my age. But with a monopod, and a lot of us will put either a tennis ball or something so that it's not vibrating with the ship, and then a faster shutter speed. So a monopod, and be in that situation. And some people have gimbal heads if they're doing birds, but a monopod's a good way to go. And I've done that a lot. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate your time.